The story begins not on land, but on the restless waters of the Mediterranean. It was the year 711 CE, and the waves carried with them men who knew their voyage was not merely a crossing, it was a point of no return. These were soldiers of the Umayyad Caliphate, hardened by desert campaigns, driven by promises of spoils and paradise, yet uncertain as they looked toward the green hills of an unfamiliar land, Hispania. At their head stood Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber general whose name would soon be carved into history, though not through gold nor through treaties, but through fire. The Visigothic kingdom that ruled Iberia was fractured, weakened by civil strife. To the Umayyads, this was an opportunity, a chance to expand their dominion, to test the reach of their faith and their arms. But opportunities are fragile things, and the men who followed Tariq knew the risks. They were few, scarcely 7,000 against an enemy said to muster tens of thousands. They were strangers in this land, cut off from reinforcements. Their lifeline the fleet of ships that had ferried them across the strait. Those ships represented safety, retreat, escape. They were the thin thread between ambition and annihilation. And that precisely was the problem. Tariq understood something his men did not. As long as the ships lay anchored behind them, gleaming on the horizon like a promise of safety, their courage would falter at the moment of trial. Fear would tempt them to turn back. Survival would whisper louder than glory. If they were to stand, if they were to fight, they must believe there was no road home but through victory. So he gave an order that has echoed through centuries. The ships, every last vessel that had carried them across the sea, were set aflame. Flames rose into the night sky, consuming wood and rope, painting the waters with a fiery reflection. The soldiers watched in horror as the smoke erased their escape. The Mediterranean, once their path of passage, became a burning barrier. The men shouted in disbelief, in anger, some perhaps in despair. What madness was this? To destroy their only means of retreat, to condemn them to fight or die. But Tariq stood firm. He summoned his men and delivered words that history, in varying forms, has preserved. "Behind you is the sea," he declared, "and before you is the enemy. By God, you have nothing left but courage and constancy." His voice carried the weight of conviction, the kind that transforms fear into fury. He reminded them of the spoils that awaited, of the weakness of the Visigoths, of the promise of paradise for those who fell. He told them that survival lay not in retreat, but in victory. The act was more than strategy. It was theater of the highest order, a psychological blow struck not at the enemy, but at his own men. By erasing the possibility of escape, Tariq did what countless generals could not. He bound his army's will to his own. Each soldier, whether trembling or emboldened, understood in that moment that his fate was sealed with the fire. To fight half-heartedly was to die. To fight with everything was to live, or at least to die with purpose. In the smoke of that burning fleet, Tariq reshaped the spirit of his army. He transformed them from an expeditionary force into men possessed by necessity. There would be no desertion, no retreat, no hesitation. Only one path remained, forward, into the land of the Visigoths, into battle, into either glory or the grave. And so they marched inland, their fear tempered into steel, their eyes set on the ridges and valleys of Hispania. Every step carried the weight of finality, the knowledge that they had severed their ties to the world they had left behind. They would not return to their homes, their families, their deserts, unless they carved a passage through conquest. Each village they approached, each patrol they clashed with, was no longer a test but a lifeline. But fear is a strange thing. When escape exists, it paralyzes. When escape vanishes, it sharpens. Tariq's men found themselves fighting with a ferocity they had not known they possessed. Every clash of steel was magnified by the knowledge that behind them lay only ashes, that the sea was no longer an ally, but a prison. Their courage became not a choice, but a necessity. Meanwhile, word of their landing spread through Hispania. To the Visigoths, it seemed absurd. A mere handful of foreigners, stranded without fleet or reinforcements, daring to challenge a kingdom. but mockery gave way to unease when reports trickled in of villages falling, of patrols overwhelmed, of the strange resolve that burned in the eyes of Tariq's soldiers. These were not raiders who could be brushed aside. These were men who fought as though possessed. The burning of the fleet was more than destruction, it was prophecy. It signaled to friend and foe alike that the invaders had wagered everything, that they could not turn back. It was an act of madness that revealed itself as genius, a gamble that transformed weakness into strength. The men who had cursed Tariq as they watched the flames rise would, in time, come to see the fire differently. It had stripped them bare of hesitation, bound them to one another, and left them with no illusions. They were alone, and only in each other could they find the strength to endure. In destroying the ships, Tariq had forged an army that could not be broken by fear of retreat. He had burned not only wood and sail, but the very thought of surrender. And so the legend began. They pressed deeper into Hispania, each mile further proof of their resolve, each skirmish a reminder of the fire that had sealed their fates. For Tariq, the gamble was only beginning. For his men, the point of no return had already passed. The sea was behind them, the enemy ahead, and the fire still burned in their memories. The campaign of 711 was no longer merely a military expedition. It had become a story of will against odds, of desperation transformed into determination, of men who marched into an unknown land because they had no choice. And in the heart of that story stood the fire-lit figure of Tariq ibn Ziyad, the general who burned his own fleet to ignite the courage of an army. The march inland after the burning of the fleet was not the triumphant parade of conquerors, but the tense advance of men with no safety net. The Andalusian landscape stretched before them in rolling hills and fertile valleys, a world far different from the arid lands they had left behind. Streams cut through fields of wheat and olives, villages dotted the ridges, and everywhere loomed the uncertainty of unseen enemies. Each dawn brought the same ritual, sharpening of blades, quiet prayers whispered under breath, glances toward the horizon where the fleet once lay, now only smoke in memory. They advanced not as raiders who could flee to their ships, but as exiles whose only homeland was the soil they seized. Tariq knew that every step deeper into Hispania tightened the noose, either around the Visigoths or around his own men. The Visigothic kingdom was fractured, yes, but it was not helpless. King Roderick, who had usurped the throne from rival claimants, commanded vast forces. Rumors spoke of his army numbering in the tens of thousands, dwarfing Tariq's 7,000 Berbers and Arabs. Yet numbers alone did not determine fate. Tariq had calculated that the Visigoths, divided by civil war and weakened by corruption, would underestimate this small band of invaders. They would assume the men stranded without ships could be swept aside. That arrogance would be their undoing. Still, doubt lingered among the soldiers. At night, by the flicker of campfires, they whispered of home, of mothers and wives they might never see again. Some cursed the fire that had stolen their ships, others swore it had stolen their fear. But all knew there was no turning back. Behind them lay only the sea, and before them the spectre of Roderick's host. Fear became not paralysis but fuel, a constant reminder that hesitation was death. Tariq himself seemed transformed by the fire. He spoke to his men not as a distant commander, but as a prophet of necessity. He told them that paradise awaited those who fell, and the riches of Hispania awaited those who endured. He painted visions of gold and silver, of cities filled with wealth beyond imagination, of victory that would write their names into history. He reminded them that the Visigoths were decadent, weighed down by luxury and division, while they were hardened by hunger, bound by desperation, and driven by the will of God. His words fused with the memory of the burning ships, and the men found themselves believing, not because hope was abundant, but because there was no alternative. The first clashes came as skirmishes on the edges of villages. Visigothic patrols stumbled upon them, expecting to scatter these stranded foreigners, only to find themselves met with ferocity, unlike anything they had seen. Tariq's men fought as if each battle was the final judgment. Steel rang out under the Spanish sun, and when the dust cleared, it was the Visigothic dead who lay in the fields. Villages whispered of invaders who fought with the strength of men possessed, who did not retreat, who pressed forward like wolves driven by hunger. Fear began to ripple through the countryside, not only among peasants, but among nobles who wondered whether Roderick truly had the strength to repel this invasion. By the summer of 711, the two forces moved inexorably toward confrontation. Tariq advanced with ruthless efficiency, gathering intelligence, exploiting divisions among local lords, offering terms to some and cutting down others. Roderick, meanwhile, scrambled to consolidate his army, summoning levies from across Hispania. His march northward brought with it a spectacle, banners streaming, cavalry thundering, nobles in their gilded armor. Yet beneath the grandeur lay discord. Some lords resented Roderick's rule, others doubted his legitimacy, and still others feared his wrath more than the foreign invaders. His army was vast but brittle, a force united more by obligation than conviction. The stage was set near the banks of the Guadalete River. Tariq's men, hardened by weeks of battle and bound by the memory of fire, stood against an army that dwarfed them, 7,000 against perhaps 20 or 30,000. The odds were absurd, the outcome seemingly inevitable. Yet Tariq had long understood what his soldiers only dimly grasped. Wars are not won by numbers alone. They are won by will, by unity, by the belief that survival demands victory. On the eve of battle, Tariq gathered his men once more. He reminded them of the fire, of the sea that no longer offered escape, of the reality that behind them lay only death and before them the chance of eternal glory. "The enemy is before you, the sea behind you," he said, echoing the words that had burned into their souls. "There is no escape. By God, victory is your only path." His speech was not mere rhetoric. It was the truth they had lived since the night their ships had been consumed. They were already the dead, and only triumph could resurrect them. The battle that followed would decide not only their fate, but the fate of Hispania itself. When dawn broke and steel clashed against steel, Tariq's men hurled themselves into combat with the ferocity of those who knew there was no retreat. The Visigoths, despite their numbers, found themselves shaken by the sheer desperation of the attackers. Divisions within Roderick's army widened as some of his nobles, resentful or disloyal, held back their full strength. Tariq seized the moment, driving wedges into their ranks, exploiting every hesitation. The clash raged for hours under the unforgiving sun, dust and blood mixing on the fields of Guadalete. In the chaos, it is said that King Roderick himself fell, though accounts differ. Some say he drowned in the river while fleeing, others that he was cut down by Tariq's men. What mattered was that his army, seeing their king destroyed, broke. Panic spread through the Visigothic lines, and what had been a battle became a rout. Tariq's 7,000 had shattered the force that was supposed to annihilate them. The impossible had been achieved, and at the heart of that impossible victory lay the fire of the ships. By destroying retreat, Tariq had created an army that could only move forward. By burning the wood of his fleet, he had forged the iron of their will. When the dust settled over the fields of Guadalete, it was not merely a battlefield that lay transformed, but the destiny of an entire peninsula. The shattered remnants of the Visigothic army drifted like broken waves, their banners trampled into mud, their nobles scattered, their king lost to history. For Tariq ibn Ziyad and his men, the victory was not only miraculous, it was absolute. 7,000 strangers, stranded on a foreign shore, had toppled a kingdom by sheer will. The fire that had consumed their ships now seemed to blaze within them, an immortal symbol of how necessity can transmute fear into invincibility. The conquest that followed was not a march so much as a cascade. Cities that had once sworn loyalty to the Visigothic crown opened their gates, either out of fear, resentment of their former rulers, or recognition of the inevitability of defeat. Cordoba, Granada, Toledo, names that would echo in centuries of history, fell not with prolonged sieges, but with astonishing swiftness. Some towns resisted, and blood was shed in their streets, but the overall tide was unstoppable. The Visigothic nobility, fractured and demoralized, could not muster a unified resistance. Tarik's men pressed on, each victory feeding the next, each conquest fueled by the knowledge that they had crossed the sea not to retreat, but to possess. The burning of the ships had become more than an act of desperation. It had become myth, whispered by both enemies and allies. Among Tarik's men, it was spoken of with reverence, a memory that steeled their resolve. Among the Visigoths, it was recounted with dread, proof that these invaders were unlike any they had faced before. For what enemy burns his own lifeline? What foe fights as if already dead? The story grew, until it no longer mattered how much of it was literal truth and how much embellishment. What mattered was its power, its ability to inspire fear and awe in equal measure. Tarik himself seemed to embody the flames he had unleashed. At every turn, he moved swiftly, decisively, unburdened by hesitation. He divided his forces to strike multiple cities at once, trusting that the same desperation that had driven them at Guadalete would carry them through. And it did. Time and again his soldiers overcame odds that would have daunted larger armies. Their reputation grew, not merely as warriors, but as instruments of inevitability. The land seemed to bend before them, as though the fire that had erased their retreat now spread across Hispania itself. Yet victory brought not only triumph, but questions. The caliphate in Damascus and its governor in Ifriqiya, Musa ibn Nusayr, had not intended for Tarik to carve so vast a conquest. The expedition across the strait had begun as a probing strike, a test of Visigothic weakness. But the fire, both literal and metaphorical, had transformed it into a full-scale invasion. Musa, wary of Tarik's growing fame, soon crossed into Hispania himself with reinforcements, partly to consolidate the conquest, partly to reassert authority over a general who was becoming a legend. Between the two of them, Visigothic rule collapsed entirely, and the Muslim dominion of Al-Andalus was born. Still, history would remember the name of Tarik ibn Ziyad more vividly than Musa's. The Rock of Gibraltar itself carried his legacy, its name derived from Jabal Tarik, the Mountain of Tarik. It stood as a stone witness to the fire he had lit, a monument to the general who had staked everything on a single gamble. That gamble had not only succeeded, it had altered the map of Europe. But beyond maps and conquests, beyond the shifting banners of kingdoms, the tale carried a deeper resonance. It revealed a truth as old as war itself. Men fight differently when no escape remains. The fire that devoured those ships did more than destroy wood and sail. It consumed hesitation. It burned away cowardice. It forced men to become what they had not known they could be. In that fire, fear was transfigured into resolve, and resolve into destiny. The story of Tarik ibn Ziyad became more than history. It became allegory. Generals and leaders across centuries would invoke his name, retell the tale of the burning fleet to inspire their own armies. It became a lesson in commitment, in the necessity of severing retreat to summon courage. Some would imitate it, others would merely borrow its symbolism, but none could deny its power. The image of ships ablaze, the horizon sealed by fire, the army left with no choice but victory or death. This was not just strategy, it was psychology distilled to its purest form. And yet, behind the grandeur of legend lay the silence of the men who had lived it. Soldiers who had cursed Tarik that night as their ships went up in flames, who had fought at Guadalete with the desperation of trapped animals, who had pressed on into cities they had never heard of. What did they think in the quiet moments between battles? Did they dream of the homes they would never return to? Did they understand that their commander had robbed them not only of retreat, but of the very possibility of escape from history's grasp? They had been bound into a story greater than themselves, a story that would outlive them, but perhaps at the cost of their own forgotten identities. In the end, the fire that Tarik set was not only for his men or his enemy. It was for history itself. It burned away the mundane details of campaign and supply, of fear and hesitation, leaving behind only the unforgettable image, ships ablaze on the shore, a general declaring that behind lay the sea and before lay the enemy, and an army transformed by necessity into the architects of conquest. And so, from the embers of that fire, Al-Andalus was born, a civilization that would flourish for centuries, shaping art, science, philosophy, and architecture, leaving a legacy as enduring as the rock that bore Tariq's name. Yet at its root, beneath all the grandeur and memory, lay one night of flames licking the sky, one decision of terrifying simplicity, to burn the ships, to erase retreat, to force men to embrace the path of no return. Thus the tale of Tariq ibn Ziyad endures, not merely as the chronicle of a battle or the conquest of a land, but as a parable of will, fear, and fire. The story of the general who destroyed escape in order to create victory, who burned wood to forge steel, who lit the night so that history itself would never forget.